Hello, hello. Welcome back to Book Talking with Library Lynn. We're over halfway through our exploration chapter by chapter of the book, How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. We've worked our way through the first three levels of reading: elementary, inspectional, and analytical. Up to this point, the authors have been talking about expository nonfiction reading. And as a review, expository nonfiction are just works that are written to teach you something. There are three stages to level 3 analytical reading, and we'll touch on those a little later in this video. But this video covers chapter 14, which is quite a departure from where we have been. This is how to read imaginative literature. So, as you may have guessed, we're going to depart completely from expository writing and even from nonfiction to look at reading imaginative literature such as lyric poetry, stories, and plays. They take 2 chapters to cover this topic. We're just going to cover the first in this video. In this chapter, they provide broad tips, rules, and thoughts on how to read imaginative literature and how it differs from the works they've been discussing. In the next chapter, chapter 15, they get much more specific about points on how to best read poetry, novels, and plays individually, and I'll discuss those in the next video. When most people think of reading for pleasure, of course, they think of reading imaginative literature, fiction. You might think that Adler and Van Doren will not take this sort of reading as seriously as they do expository writing, which they took the first half of the book to explain. But if that's what you're thinking, you're wrong. They take imaginative literature very seriously. But because these types of books are so different, the rules often don't apply. And where they do, they have to be tweaked. Now, they say that just because most people who read literature for fun really enjoy the reading process, that doesn't mean that they're reading well. Of course not. To them, the test for reading imaginative works well is whether or not you can isolate why the book is good. You enjoyed it, yes or no, but why? I'm going to stop here to say there's nothing, in my opinion, wrong with enjoying a book without analyzing why you enjoyed it. In fact, for some people, the process of analyzing it might destroy everything they liked about reading the book. They don't address this possibility at all. They are, as I have said before, talking about serious books. Fiction can be just as serious as nonfiction. You can learn from it just like you can learn from nonfiction. But if your reason for reading is just to while away some enjoyable hours with characters you like and a story that keeps your attention riveted to the page, you have my permission, for what it's worth, to just carry on with what you've been doing. In other words, I don't think there's anything to be gained from spoiling your experience just because these two guys think you should. But if you're one of those people who want to eke out every drop of instruction and worth you can from everything you read, then you would profit from applying these lessons. So let's move on to the lessons themselves. In this chapter, they cover a list of don'ts for reading imaginative literature. There are things in this book that they've hammered into their readers as necessary for adequately reading an informative work, but some of these should not be applied to imaginative works, and I think that makes perfect sense. Next, they talk about rules that should be followed in general. Here's the main difference between reading what's been covered in this book so far and what's covered in this chapter. Expository works aim to teach. They are primarily concerned with getting to the truth. Imaginative works, on the other hand, aim to please, and they are primarily concerned with presenting beauty. Okay, so now let's first cover their don'ts. There are 3 of them. Don't number 1. Don't try to resist the effect that a work of imaginative literature has on you. The author is, in a sense, they say, trying to put a spell on you. They want to transport you through your imagination to certain places, events, and having certain feelings. So your first job is to drop the critical mindset and just let yourself be carried away by whatever the author is presenting. I think most people who read fiction already do that. I'm not sure if they don't why they're reading for fun anyway. When you read an expository work, definitions of words are important. They're important in imaginative literature too, but often in the opposite way. Definitions in expository works need to be narrowed down to a fine point so there's no ambiguity about what the author means, what they're saying. But in imaginative works, it's the exact opposite. The author is using words in a broader meaning of the word. The more definitions there are to the words, the more possibility that the word will be evocative, and that's what the author usually is after. Okay, on to don't number 2. Don't look for terms, propositions, and arguments in imaginative literature. Terms, propositions, and arguments are logical. Imaginative literature is poetic. In other words, the teaching done in imaginative literature is through vicarious experience, not through logical thought. What we can learn from these works is every bit as important, they say, but they are an exercise in imaginative experience. They teach us different things in a totally different way. Just let yourself get caught up in the story, they say, and you should learn lessons along with the characters. And number 3, the final don't. Don't criticize fiction by standards of truth and consistency that properly apply to communication of knowledge. You don't reject a work of imaginative literature because in the world you were reading about, it's not consistent with our world. There may be 12 moons, each a different shade of red in the book you're reading about. That's not true in our world, but you suspend your argumentative mind in order to immerse yourself in the author's world. I don't think most people have a problem with this. I don't think that point needs to be belabored. So the truth of a story is its intrinsic probability or plausibility. If in a story you read, dogs can fly and they frequently ferry cats to appointments, as long as the author sticks with this convention, it should be believed within the confines of the story. They quote Aristotle here: "The standard of correctness is not the same in poetry as in politics." Suspend expectations and beliefs to immerse yourself in the story. As long as what happens in the story makes sense there, that's all that matters. So, okay, that's it for the don'ts. Now for the general rules they offer. All right. In analytical reading, as I mentioned before, they broke the process down into 3 stages, and the 3 stages are as follows. Number 1, you need to discover the book's structure. Number 2, you do the interpretive work to identify and interpret all the component parts of the work. And number 3, to criticize what the author is saying, you follow their critical rules. Okay, they address how to modify the rules to work with imaginative literature. So first we'll talk about structure. Number 1, classify the work according to its kind. Is it a story, a novel, or a play, for example? Number 2, grasp the unity of the work. For a story or a play, that's the plot. For a lyric poem, it may be the emotion they're trying to convey. And number 3, determine the parts of the unity. Like in a story, the plot points and the characters are parts that make up the unity of the story. They state a big difference between the structure in an expository and an imaginative work is that in expository works, you can read any section of the book and they should make sense on their own. You can skip right to chapter 15 and read it, and it should make sense. That's not possible with imaginative works. You can't pick up a novel and start with chapter 15 and expect to understand everything that's going on. Okay, now moving on to the second stage of analytical reading, interpretive rules. They have 3 things to keep in mind here. Number 1, determine what elements of the work are. In fiction, that would be episodes, incidents, characters, their thoughts, speeches, feelings, and actions. Number 2, terms are connected in propositions. I'm not sure why they state things the way they do sometimes. It seems to me here they're being a little bit deliberately obtuse. All this means is that things that happen in the book always hold the background, the settings, the events that took place before the story begins, and so on. The background holds the story together. So basically they're just saying you need to understand what holds the world together. I think people do that intuitively. And number 3, become acquainted with the characters. I don't really see how you can read, say, a novel without doing this, but they make the point anyway. Now these 2 previous sets of rules apply primarily to novels and plays. They'll discuss lyric poetry more thoroughly in the next chapter. Okay, moving on to the 3rd stage of analytical reading, critical rules. They only give you 1 here. Don't criticize imaginative writing until you fully appreciate what the author has tried to make you experience. You can't just DNF a book and then criticize it. You haven't given it a fair shot at that point. You can say you didn't finish it, but you can't say it was a bad or a good book. And a corollary to this rule is to accept the world the author has created as it is. They really put a lot of emphasis on that. Don't argue, for instance, that the story of Dune would be better told from a watery planet. That's just not something that it's okay to do. You don't agree or disagree with fiction, they say. You either like it or you don't. And always, they say, keep in mind that a work of imaginative literature should be judged primarily on its beauty. I don't even know where to start with that statement, unless by beauty they mean a well-constructed story that brings about a satisfying experience. I guess that makes sense, but not all literature is beautiful. I guess it depends on your definition of beautiful, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless or worthless. Life itself is not always beautiful after all. And to sum all this up, I'm going to read to you what they say at the bottom of page 213. Let us restate the maxims then in the following manner. Before you express your likes and dislikes, you must first be sure that you have made an honest effort to appreciate the work. By appreciation, we mean having the experience that the author tried to produce for you by working on your emotions and imagination. Thus, you cannot appreciate a novel by reading it passively. Indeed, as we have remarked, you must read it passionately, any more than you can understand a philosophical book that way. To achieve appreciation as far as to achieve understanding, you must read actively. And that means performing all the acts of analytical reading that we have briefly outlined. But once you have done all this to the best of your ability, you are in a position to judge the merits of an imaginary work or an imaginative work. And you are in a position not only to say that you liked or disliked it, but why? And they say, if you get in the habit of doing this, you'll be able to find a community of readers that share your standards of criticism. Maybe. In their world, at least. They end the chapter by stating that good taste can be acquired by anyone who learns to read, and that's encouraging. This brings up a topic of interest for me, though. I'd like to know, do you have a community of fellow readers who share your standards? If you do, let me know. Comment about it below. Where did you find these people? What tips would you have for developing a true reading community that shares your standards? In the next chapter, as promised, we will get down to the nitty-gritty as we explore Chapter 15, Suggestions for Reading Stories, Plays, and Poems. And if you want to have a book to practice suggestions on, you could try my first novel, The Robin's Nest. Have fun reading about a widow in late middle age who buys a used bookstore only to discover it's already inhabited by fairies. Zaniness ensues as our heroine discovers there is more to herself than she ever imagined. You can find the book at the link below. And until next time, happy reading.